Imagine a single flower bulb, small, dark, onion-like object that becomes worth more money than a mansion, a sprawling farm, or even a fleet of ships. This is the true story of the Tulip Mania, the world's first massive financial bubble, which took place in 17th century Holland, the wealthiest nation on earth at the time. How did a simple bloom imported from Turkey turn rational merchants and tradesmen into reckless gamblers? How did an entire economy become fixated on something so fragile? And what happens when a whole nation wakes up one morning to find that the source of its immense wealth is suddenly worth nothing? This story is a deep dive into human greed, mass hysteria, and the terrifying power of speculation. This story is 6 chapters long, and we hope you love it. Chapter 1. Our story begins in the Netherlands, in the mid-17th century, a time historians call the Dutch Golden Age. This was a small, seafaring nation that had suddenly become unimaginably wealthy. Dutch ships sailed to every corner of the globe, bringing back silks from China, spices from Indonesia, and vast amounts of silver and gold. Every city, from Amsterdam to Haarlem, was bustling with new money, new art, and new, exotic tastes. The citizens of this prosperous new republic were obsessed with showing off their status. They wanted fine portraits, grander houses, and above all, exotic rarities that proved their sophisticated worldliness. Into this world of immense, sudden wealth came a single, beautiful import that would consume the entire nation: the tulip. The tulip wasn't native to Holland. It had been imported decades earlier from the distant mountains of Turkey. The flower was sleek, symmetrical, and unlike anything the Europeans had ever seen. It was exotic, expensive, and difficult to grow, instantly making it the perfect symbol of status for the rich merchant class. Owning a tulip garden was like owning a private museum filled with priceless jewels. But the tulip craze truly began when the wealthy elite started competing not just to own any tulip, but to own the most unique and rarest varieties. These were not the common red or yellow flowers you see today. These were the prized, streaked, and feathered varieties that seemed to defy nature. The demand soon created a secondary market for the tulip bulb itself, the small, unassuming onion-like object from which the flower grew. This bulb was where the value truly rested. A person didn't buy a flower to look at, they bought the bulb so they could plant it, cultivate it, and watch its lineage multiply. But because the bulbs were only harvested and traded during the summer months, a system of paper contracts began to develop. People started buying the promise of a future bulb, a piece of paper, guaranteeing a certain flower would be delivered in 6 months. This was the first step toward pure speculation. The price of the rarest bulbs was already astronomical, sometimes costing more than a skilled craftsman earned in an entire year. But the market was only just starting to warm up. We must now turn our attention to the stunning, biological secret of the flower that would transform it from a simple luxury item into the world's first true speculative commodity. Chapter 2. The tulip was already an object of wealth. But what truly drove the prices into the stratosphere was a mysterious, almost magical natural phenomenon. Most tulips, when healthy, bloom in a single, solid color: red, yellow, or white. But sometimes, a bulb would produce a flower that was wildly different. It would display sharp, beautiful streaks and flames of contrasting colors running through the petals. These highly patterned flowers, where red and white or purple and yellow blended in impossible ways, were known as broken tulips. These broken tulips were considered masterpieces of nature, but the way they acquired these patterns was completely unknown and unpredictable to the growers of the 17th century. We now know that the patterns were caused by a virus, a tiny, invisible disease carried by aphids that infected the bulb. The virus was not harmful to the flower's life, but it messed with the pigment, creating the stunning, unique broken effect. This biological mystery created immediate, intense rarity. A grower could plant 100 solid-colored bulbs, and only a handful, or sometimes none at all, would break into the valuable, streaked variety. Furthermore, the bulb might produce a brilliant broken flower one year, and then revert back to a solid, common color the next. The beauty was unstable, fragile, and utterly unpredictable. This unpredictability was the engine of the mania. Because no one could guarantee which bulbs would break, and because the virus often weakened the bulb, these flowers were exceptionally difficult to cultivate and multiply. The rarity of names like Semper Augustus, a striking red and white, or Viceroy purple, crimson, and yellow became legendary. These weren't just flowers. They were unique, living pieces of art, and they commanded insane prices that made the fortunes of common luxury goods look cheap. To own a single bulb of the Semper Augustus was the ultimate statement of wealth and power. It was like owning the only painting by the greatest artist in the world. As the most valuable bulbs became locked away in the collections of the ultra-wealthy, the rest of the market, driven by intense desire and the thrill of the unpredictable, began looking for any way to get a piece of the action. This obsession with rarity, created by a simple, hidden virus, now set the stage for the crucial shift from gardening to pure, dangerous speculation. The obsession with these rare, fragile, broken tulips eventually led to a fundamental change in how the entire market worked. The growing season for the tulip is short. You plant the bulb in the autumn, it blooms in the spring, and you dig it up for sale in the summer. For most of the year, The bulb itself was underground and couldn't be physically traded. This seasonal restriction should have slowed the market down, but instead, it did the opposite. It created a world based entirely on paper promises. The wealthy merchants and ambitious newcomers didn't want to wait until summer. They started trading futures contracts. A futures contract was a simple, legal document where the seller promised to deliver a specific bulb, say, 3 Viceroy bulbs, to the buyer at a set price, 6 months from now. Critically, the buyer didn't pay the full price up front. They only put down a small deposit. This paper trade transformed the tulip from a beautiful, fragile flower into a pure financial commodity. Suddenly, the people buying and selling the contracts were no longer professional growers or wealthy gardeners. They were tradesmen, sailors, chimney sweeps, and even servants. They didn't care about the color of the petals or the health of the bulb. They only cared that the piece of paper they held was worth more today than it was yesterday. The bulb itself became almost irrelevant. It was the promise of the bulb that was traded. This type of speculation trading, something you didn't physically own, based only on the hope that its price would rise, was called windhandel by the Dutch. The word literally means wind trade, because the commodity they were trading was as fleeting and invisible as the wind itself. This separation of the market from the physical object was the most dangerous shift. When a farmer buys grain, he knows he can eat it or sell it for bread. The value is always grounded in a necessity, but the tulip bulb offered no such certainty. Its value was entirely based on the belief that the next person would pay even more for it. This was the moment the market stopped being about horticulture and started being about mass psychology. The high risk and the small barrier to entry, you only needed a small deposit to buy a massive contract, ruined thousands of people. Everyone who joined the trade instantly became a professional gambler, convinced they could sell their paper promises before the invisible market caught on to the fact that they were trading nothing but hot air and hopes. Chapter 3. The fever had now spread far beyond the quiet rooms of wealthy merchants and the gardens of expert botanists. Because the trading was all done on paper, and because you only needed a small deposit to buy a massive contract, the market exploded into the streets, drawing in every layer of Dutch society. This was no longer a hobby for the rich. It was a get-rich-quick scheme that promised to make anyone wealthy overnight. The trading was chaotic and intoxicating. It didn't take place on a formal stock exchange. Instead, the real business of the tulip market was conducted in smoky, loud, and bustling taverns across the cities of Haarlem and Amsterdam. Tradesmen, bakers, brewers, shoemakers, sailors, and even housemaids would crowd around small tables, yelling prices and shaking hands on contracts that might involve the worth of an entire farm. Imagine a simple shoemaker, Jan, who walks into a tavern. He's never speculated on anything in his life. He sees his neighbor, a baker named Peter, who last week could barely afford yeast, now bragging about owning a Viceroy contract worth twice his house. Jan watches as Peter sells that contract for a huge profit, but profit Jan realizes would take him 10 years of backbreaking work to earn. The temptation was enormous. This environment created a powerful, addictive force: mass psychology. Every success story, every brag, every skyrocketing price created immense fear of missing out, the powerful feeling that if you didn't buy now, you would be the only poor person left in Holland. People stopped asking, "What is this flower actually worth?" and started asking, "How much will the person next to me pay for it tomorrow?" The price of a single rare bulb began to double, sometimes triple, in a single week. To purchase a handful of popular bulbs now cost more than an expert cabinet maker could earn in 20 years. The prices became entirely disconnected from reality. Yet, fueled by the desperate hope of instant wealth, people began taking incredible, reckless chances. They sold their houses, mortgaged their land, and liquidated every asset they owned, all to buy more paper contracts. The very foundations of the Dutch economy were being pulled out of the ground and wrapped up in the fragile promise of a flower bulb. This incredible acceleration would soon reach a point of utter absurdity, where the value of a single bulb could feed 1,000 people for a year. The market wasn't just expensive anymore. It had crossed the line into complete economic fantasy. As the winter of 1636 approached, the price increases stopped being measured in percentages and started being measured in real-world assets. The value of a single bulb could now purchase entire estates. Consider the infamous Semper Augustus. At its peak, a single bulb of this streaked red and white variety sold for 6,000 guilders. To put this number into perspective, a master craftsman in Holland earned about 150 guilders a year. A grand multi-story house on a canal in Amsterdam, the heart of the commercial world, could be purchased for about 10,000 guilders. The contract for one rare tulip bulb could be swapped for a massive pile of wheat, rye, and beer, enough to feed hundreds of families for a year. The frenzy was no longer focused on the actual flower, but on the number. The market was driven by momentum, not money. Everyone was borrowing money against their existing assets, their ships, their land, their businesses, to buy more tulip contracts. Confident they could sell the contract in a week for 20% more, this was the ultimate chain letter of wealth. To understand the madness, we must briefly pause and consider the alternative. The Dutch were masters of rational, global trade. When a Dutch merchant invested in a spice ship, he was buying a small piece of a tangible asset. If the ship came back, he made a profit based on real, existing goods. If the ship sank, he knew the risk. But the tulip bulb offered no such certainty. It was an object that, at its core, was just a pretty flower. The entire value of the paper contract was built on the collective fantasy that tomorrow, someone else would be crazier than you were. The longer this went on, the more nervous the professional merchants became. They had seen the price double, then quadruple, then octuple, based purely on excitement. But economic history is clear. Anything that goes up this fast, without a foundation in real value, must eventually come down. The stage was set, and the slightest tremor of doubt was all it would take to shatter the world's most beautiful, and most fragile, financial bubble. Chapter 4. The market was roaring, but behind the frantic shouting in the taverns, the first subtle tremors of doubt began to appear. These didn't come from the new speculators, the bakers, the cobblers, and the servants who were still blinded by greed. The doubt came from the very people who had started the craze, the wealthy, professional Dutch merchants, who understood money, trade, and true value. These men weren't fools. They had made their fortunes by trading spices, textiles, and ships' tangible goods with real worth. They watched with growing alarm as their countrymen swapped their entire life savings for a single bulb, now priced higher than their own Amsterdam homes. They knew exactly how much labor went into producing a tulip, and they knew the maximum price a real collector would ever pay. The current prices had exceeded that reality 1,000 times over. These sophisticated merchants began to act, but they did so quietly and they didn't scream sell in the taverns, because panic would destroy their chance to profit. Instead, they began to unload their paper contracts, selling their promises of future bulbs to the eager crowds of common speculators. They were selling at the highest possible prices, making fortunes that were truly unbelievable. This created a moral and emotional dilemma for the sellers. They were selling the promise of wealth to people who couldn't afford the loss, fully aware that the paper they were trading was a lie that was about to be exposed. The wealthy men didn't stop to ask if it was right. They simply focused on getting their real guilders out of the market before the crash came. This quiet sell-off was the initial, almost invisible crack in the bubble's foundation. It meant that the money holding the market up was rapidly shifting from people who had financial reserves to those who had staked everything they owned. The professionals were trading their paper promises for real silver and gold. They were exiting the game, leaving the entire market vulnerable to sudden collapse. Supported only by the desperate optimism of the common man, the price of the bulbs was still rising, but the actual, stable money underneath the market was vanishing. Everyone was still yelling buy, but the wise money was already halfway out the door. The market was ready to break, but it just needed a single push. That push came in early February 1637. In the city of Haarlem, where the tulip frenzy was arguably the strongest, an auction was held. This wasn't unusual. Auctions happened daily. A lot of tulip contracts were offered for sale, and everyone expected the usual outcome. Buyers would eagerly bid the prices up, continuing the relentless climb. But at this particular auction, something terrifying happened. A buyer failed to show up. It wasn't a massive event. Perhaps the bidder had fallen ill, or simply changed his mind. But when the contracts went unsold at the expected sky-high price, a quiet, chilling moment of silence fell over the usually chaotic tavern. For the first time in 3 years, the relentless price momentum had stopped. This single failure shattered the mass psychological spell. The common speculator who had mortgaged his house and borrowed money from his friends suddenly realized the terrifying truth. The value of his contract was not based on the flower's worth, but only on the promise that someone else would pay more. Now, for the first time, no one was willing to pay more. The shift in mood was instantaneous and devastating. The powerful force of greed that had driven the market for years was instantly replaced by an even more powerful force: panic and fear. Imagine that shoemaker, Jan, who had invested everything. He runs to the tavern to sell his contract, confident in his quick profit, but he finds no buyers. He lowers the price by 10%, still no buyers. He lowers it by 50%, nothing. He begins to shout, desperate to get any real money back before it's too late. But every other small speculator is doing the exact same thing. Suddenly, there are 1,000 sellers and 0 buyers. The realization that they were all trading wind paper backed by nothing swept through Holland. The fever broke, replaced by a sudden cold terror. In the space of less than a week, the value of the most precious tulip bulbs dropped by over 90%. The most exclusive variety, which could have purchased an entire estate just days ago, was now worthless. The massive, national financial bubble that was built on beautiful, fragile hope had burst, leaving behind a nation drowning in debt and legal chaos. Chapter 5. The crash wasn't just a sudden drop in price. It was the total, frozen paralysis of the entire Dutch economy. The moment the prices stopped rising, the paper contracts, the very engine of the mania, became nothing more than worthless scribbles. The problem lay in the nature of the wind trade. Remember the shoemaker, Jan. In November, he had signed a contract promising to pay 5,000 guilders for a bulb to be delivered in March. based on the assumption he could immediately sell that contract for 6,000 guilders. But in February, the value of that bulb plummeted to less than 50 guilders. Jan now had a legal obligation to pay 5,000 guilders for something worth 50 guilders, and the person who sold him that contract, the wealthy merchant, was now demanding the money. But Jan couldn't pay, because he had already spent his savings and mortgaged his house. The person who sold him the contract now couldn't pay his upstream debts. The disaster spread like wildfire through the entire system. Fueled by debt, everyone was financially connected to everyone else in a massive, interconnected web of futures contracts. Everyone was rich on paper, but now, everyone was bankrupt in reality. The atmosphere in the bustling Dutch cities changed overnight. The noisy, frenzied shouting in the taverns was replaced by a chilling silence. Despair hung heavy in the air. The courts were immediately flooded with legal cases. Thousands of people who were creditors, the sellers who were owed money, demanded that the contracts be honored. But the debtors, the speculators who had promised to pay huge sums, argued that the entire trade was a form of gambling, and therefore should be declared illegal and unenforceable. The very government that had allowed the mania to flourish now faced a complete societal breakdown. If the contracts were enforced, entire cities would face mass bankruptcy, rioters would take to the streets, and the financial foundation of the Dutch Golden Age would crumble. But if the contracts were declared void, it would be an attack on the very concept of trade and credit that made Holland rich. The crisis had moved beyond the flower bulb. It was now a fundamental test of the law and order of the Republic itself. The Dutch government and the provincial courts were now faced with an impossible choice. The economic damage was so deep and widespread that a simple legal ruling would either plunge the entire nation into bankruptcy or destroy the very foundation of their global trade. If the judges ruled that the contracts were valid, then thousands of middle-class families would lose their homes, assets, and reputations. The system of credit, which was vital to Holland's shipping and trading empire, would be preserved, but the human cost would be catastrophic, likely leading to riots and civil unrest in the streets. If the judges ruled that the contracts were invalid, saying the entire tulip trade was a form of gambling and therefore illegal, they would save the debtors' homes. But this action would set a dangerous precedent. It would tell the world that a contract signed in Holland could be later invalidated by the government. For a nation built on international credit and the sanctity of trade agreements, this was unthinkable. They would be destroying the very trust that made the Dutch Golden Age possible. The authorities were paralyzed. They held emergency meetings and formed committees, but no one could find a solution that satisfied both justice and economic reality. They tried to compromise, suggesting that the contracts signed after a certain date should only be paid at a fraction of their value, or that debtors should only pay 10% of the promised price. But the confusion and resistance were too great. People were already broke. They couldn't even pay 10% of an imaginary debt. Ultimately, the Dutch legal system simply ground to a halt. There was no official decisive ruling that settled the debts. The government, unable to find a legal solution, quietly stepped away and let the crisis resolve itself through private failure. This inaction meant that the massive debts created by the mania were never officially collected. Thousands of debtors were technically ruined, but since their creditors were often also debtors themselves, the financial web simply dissolved into uncollectible claims. Fortunes were lost, reputations were ruined, and years of legal fighting followed. But the immediate crisis of mass bankruptcy was avoided through sheer administrative paralysis. The bubble had burst, the paper was worthless, and Holland learned a terrifying lesson about the power of mass delusion, a lesson that would echo through global markets for centuries to come. Chapter 6. The immediate aftermath of the Tulip Mania was a time of deep humiliation and despair in Holland. While the government's paralysis managed to prevent total societal collapse and starvation, the financial wreckage was everywhere. Thousands of once proud citizens, the tradesmen, the sailors, the bakers who had been millionaires on paper just weeks before, were now ruined. They had lost their homes, their businesses, and their reputations. The air was thick, not just with debt, but with bitter betrayal. People fought with their neighbors, their friends, and their families, each blaming the other for starting the trade and for not selling fast enough. For many years after the crash, the memory of the Tulip Mania hung over the cities like a financial ghost. The tulip, which had been the proud symbol of status and wealth, became a symbol of irrationality and foolishness. To call someone a tulip trader was a severe insult, and the word tulip itself entered the Dutch language as a warning against any financial scheme that promised too much, too fast. To truly grasp the absurdity of this event, we must look at what else the Dutch were doing at the exact same time. This was the same nation that pioneered modern capitalism and invented the stock exchange. They were trading shares in the Dutch East India Company (VOC), which was a massive multinational corporation that owned ships, territories, armies, and controlled the global spice trade. When you bought a share of the VOC, you were buying a small piece of a tangible, wealth-producing machine. The Dutch knew the difference between a rational investment and a fantasy. But the fever of the tulip was so intense, so intoxicatingly rapid, that it allowed people to completely abandon logic. The mania proved that even the most intelligent and commercially savvy society can be completely overtaken by the terrifying power of mass delusion. The lesson was clear. It takes immense courage to be the first person to call a bubble a lie and the first person to sell, because the pressure of the crowd demanding that you stay and get rich is almost impossible to resist. This small, forgotten flower had given the world its first, brutal lesson in economic psychology, a lesson that would be repeated in stock markets around the world for centuries to come. The crisis of 1637 was a devastating local event for Holland, but its impact stretched far beyond the canals of Amsterdam. The Tulip Mania earned its place in history not because of the money that was lost, but because it was the world's very first, fully documented, large-scale speculative economic bubble. It provided a terrifying blueprint for all the financial booms and busts that would follow over the next 4 centuries. The pattern established by the flower bulb has been seen repeatedly. 1. The new asset. A new commodity or stock is introduced. Tulips, gold, internet stocks, housing. 2. The fever. News of easy money spreads, drawing in everyone from experts to absolute beginners. 3. The delusion. The price becomes utterly detached from the item's true, intrinsic value. Value is based solely on the belief that the next person will pay more. 4. The crash. A small, unexpected failure triggers a mass panic, and the price drops instantly, returning to its real value, 0. The most powerful legacy of the Tulip Mania is not economic, it is psychological. It showed that human greed and the fear of missing out are forces more powerful than rationality. The smartest merchants in the world, the men who invented modern global abandon their logic and ruined themselves over a single, delicate flower. The citizens of the Dutch Golden Age eventually recovered their economy, focusing once again on the steady, reliable trade of spices and goods. But the lesson of the tulip remains a constant, bright warning across history. If a group of people believes a thing is worth an infinite amount, they can make it true for a short, brilliant time. But every bubble, no matter how beautiful or intoxicating, will always burst, proving that you can't build a stable economy on the ephemeral beauty of a flower or the fleeting promise of the wind. The world never forgot the story of the tiny, streaked tulip that taught humanity the terrifying danger of collective irrationality.